The lecture hall hummed with a strange energy. Rows of seats spiraled upward in a circular design, each level occupied by beings that looked nothing like each other. Some had multiple arms, others had skin that seemed to shimmer and change colors. Holographic displays flickered around each student, showing complex environmental data and survival scenarios. At the center of this extraordinary room stood Professor Caltrix. His body was unlike anything a human would consider normal. Four tentacle-like appendages emerged from a central mass that might be called a body, and his head, if you could call it that, was a cluster of moving eyes that could look in multiple directions at once. Each eye was a different color: deep purple, electric blue, emerald green, and a soft golden yellow. Jae-Hwan Park sat quietly in the third row from the bottom. He was the only human in the entire class of interstellar survival techniques at the Galactic Research University. Most of his classmates barely noticed him, which was exactly how he preferred it. His dark hair was cut short, and he wore the standard gray uniform of the university. Simple, functional, unremarkable. Professor Caltrix's voice rolled through the lecture hall. It wasn't a voice in the way humans understand sound. Instead, it was a series of vibrations that translated directly into each student's mind. The universal translation technology made sure every student understood perfectly. Today, the professor began, we will discuss the most critical aspect of survival across different planetary environments. His tentacles moved in complex patterns, activating a massive holographic display that showed various terrains: frozen tundras, dense forests, volcanic landscapes, and worlds with atmospheres toxic to most known life forms. Jae-Hwan leaned forward slightly. This was the class he had been waiting for. While other students came from advanced civilizations with technology that could create shelters in seconds, he understood something more fundamental. Survival wasn't about technology. It was about understanding. The holographic display shifted, showing a series of failed survival attempts. Students from different species had attempted to survive in extreme conditions, and most had failed dramatically. A six-armed creature from the Andromeda cluster had tried to use energy shields in a magnetic storm. Failure. A silicon-based life form had attempted to navigate through a dense jungle without understanding basic environmental interactions. Complete disaster. Survival, Professor Caltrix continued, is not about the tools you carry. It is about the knowledge you possess and the adaptability of your species. Several students shifted uncomfortably. Most came from civilizations where technology solved every problem. The idea of survival without advanced tools seemed almost primitive to them. Jae-Hwan's eyes remained fixed on the professor. He knew what was coming. The practical exam that had made generations of students from advanced civilizations fail spectacularly. Professor Caltrix's multiple eyes seemed to focus directly on Jae-Hwan. Our practical examination will test your most fundamental survival skills. You will be transported to a hostile environment with minimal resources. Your task will be simple: survive and create shelter using only what you can find in your immediate environment. A wave of nervous murmurs swept through the lecture hall. Alien students exchanged worried glances. Some began checking their high-tech survival gear. Others looked at complex mathematical models of survival probability. Jae-Hwan simply smiled. A small, quiet smile that went unnoticed by everyone except Professor Caltrix. For just a moment, one of the professor's golden eyes seemed to narrow, almost in recognition of a coming challenge. The lecture continued, but something had changed in the room. A subtle tension hung in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. The examination was coming, and nothing would be the same after. The testing ground was nothing like a classroom. A massive transport ship hung in the sky, its metallic surface reflecting the harsh light of two distant suns. Below, a landscape of twisted trees, rocky ground, and patches of strange moss stretched out in every direction. This was survival territory, raw, unforgiving, and completely alien. Jae-Hwan stood with the other students, each wearing a simple protective suit that looked more like a thin layer of colored fabric than serious survival gear. Around him, his classmates looked nervous. A blue-skinned student with 4 arms kept checking a small device that looked like a complex computer. Another student, something that resembled a walking crystal, seemed to be calculating survival probabilities. Professor Keltrix floated above them, his multiple eyes scanning the group. "Your challenge is simple," he announced, his voice cutting through their minds like a sharp knife. "You will have one planetary rotation, approximately 24 hours in standard time, to create a shelter that protects you from the environment. You may use only what you find around you. No advanced technology. No energy shields. No molecular assemblers. Nothing." A ripple of shock went through the group. Most of the alien students came from worlds where technology solved every problem. They had machines that could build entire cities in hours. They had energy systems that could create perfect climate-controlled environments instantly. The idea of building shelter with just their hands and local materials seemed impossible. Jae-hwan remained calm. He looked at the landscape, studying it carefully. The trees were thick, with bark that looked almost like leather. Some had branches that twisted in strange angles. The ground was covered with rocks and a kind of moss that seemed to change color depending on the light. "You will be monitored," Professor Keltrix continued. "Any use of technology beyond basic survival tools will result in immediate disqualification. Your shelter must protect you from temperature changes, potential predators, and environmental risks." The blue-skinned student raised a hand. "What about our natural abilities?" he asked. "My species can generate electrical fields for protection." The professor's eyes swirled with a mix of colors. "Your natural biological capabilities are allowed, but no technological enhancements. This is a test of pure survival skill." A timer appeared in the air, a holographic display that seemed to hang between the students and the landscape. It showed exactly 24 hours, slowly beginning to count down. Some students immediately ran toward the trees. They began trying to use their unique biological abilities. The crystal-like student seemed to be attempting to grow a shelter from local minerals. The blue-skinned student tried to generate some kind of energy field. Jae-hwan watched them for a moment. Then he began to walk, moving slowly and carefully. He wasn't rushing. He was observing. The landscape was full of challenges. Patches of ground looked solid but were actually soft and marshy. Some trees looked perfect for building, but were filled with small creatures that would make construction difficult. The wind carried strange sounds, clicks and whistles that suggested hidden life forms. Most of the alien students were working frantically. They were using complex methods, trying to apply scientific principles to shelter building. They measured angles. They calculated wind resistance. They tried to use their advanced knowledge. Jae-hwan simply walked. He picked up a few rocks. He tested the strength of tree branches. He looked at how the moss grew. He was learning about the environment, not fighting against it. Professor Keltrix watched him with growing interest. Of all the students, this human was the only one who seemed truly calm. While others panicked and rushed, Jae-hwan moved with purpose, but a purpose that was not yet clear. The timer continued to count down. 24 hours would pass quickly, and somewhere in this alien landscape, a shelter needed to be built. The planet's surface was not kind. Sharp rocks jutted from the ground like broken teeth. The trees looked more like twisted metal than living plants, with bark that seemed to shimmer and change color in the strange light. Wind carried sounds that were not quite natural, a mix of low humming and high-pitched clicks. Jae-hwan moved carefully. His boots made soft sounds against the rocky ground. Around him, the other students were already in full panic mode. The crystal-like student had created some kind of mineral shield that looked impressive but seemed totally impractical. A student with 6 tentacles was trying to weave some kind of shelter using energy fields that kept flickering and dying. The environment was challenging. Temperature changes happened quickly. One moment, heat would beat down from the 2 suns overhead. The next moment, a cold wind would sweep across the landscape, dropping the temperature by what felt like 20 degrees. Most of the alien students' technology failed in these rapid shifts. Jae-hwan noticed something most others missed. The moss on the ground changed color with temperature. The rocks had strange patterns that showed wind direction. The twisted trees were not random. They grew in ways that showed protection from the harshest winds. Near a cluster of rocks, he stopped and studied the ground carefully. Most students ran around looking for perfect building materials. They used scanners. They tried complex mathematical calculations. Jae-hwan just looked and listened. The blue-skinned four-armed student approached him. "Why are you just standing there?" he asked, his extra arms moving nervously. Complex devices hung from each arm, all of them now useless. "Watching," Jae-hwan replied simply. Professor Keltrix watched from above. His multiple eyes tracked every movement. Something about the human was different. While other students fought the environment, this one seemed to be reading it like a book. Time was running out. The holographic timer showed less than 18 hours remaining. Most students had created nothing useful. Their shelters looked like strange art projects, complex but completely impractical. The landscape was full of challenges. Rocks that looked solid could crumble with a touch. Trees that seemed strong were actually weak and hollow. Small creatures moved just under the ground's surface, creating slight movements that most students didn't even notice. Jae-hwan began to move with purpose. He picked up rocks. He tested tree branches. He looked at how the moss grew in different areas. He wasn't just looking, he was understanding. The crystal student's shelter had already collapsed. The six-tentacled student's energy field was flickering dangerously. Their high-tech approaches were failing quickly. Wind picked up. The temperature dropped again. Small creatures began to make strange sounds, warning sounds that suggested the night would be dangerous. Professor Keltrix's eyes continued to track Jae-hwan. The human moved differently from the others. No panic, no rush, just careful, steady movements. Some students started to look scared. Their technology was failing. Their complex plans were falling apart. The planet seemed to be fighting against their every attempt to survive. Jae-hwan picked up a thick branch. He tested its strength. He looked at the wind direction. He studied the ground carefully. While others saw a hostile environment, he saw a system, a complex, living system that could be understood. The timer continued to count down. Survival was not about fighting the environment. It was about understanding it. And Jae-hwan was beginning to understand something the other students had completely missed. As the suns began to set, casting long shadows across the alien landscape, Jae-hwan started his work. The other students watched in confusion. Some even laughed, but he moved with a calm that seemed almost out of place in the chaos around him. First, he found a large, flat rock. Not just any rock, but one with edges that were almost perfectly straight. Most students would have walked past it. Jae-hwan saw it as his first tool. He tested its edge against another stone, carefully creating a sharp cutting surface. The blue-skinned student with four arms approached. "What are you doing?" he asked, his extra arms moving nervously. "We have hours left, and you're playing with rocks." Jae-hwan didn't answer. Instead, he selected his first tree. Not the biggest, not the straightest, but the one that looked strong and had the right shape. He examined its trunk carefully, looking at the bark, the way the branches grew, the slight lean of the tree. Professor Keltrix floated closer. His multiple eyes focused intensely on Jae-hwan's movements. Something was happening that the professor had never seen before. Using his rock-made tool and another stone, Jae-hwan began to work on the tree. The movements were slow but precise. Each strike was calculated, each moment planned. The other students watched in growing confusion. Their complex energy tools had failed. Their advanced scanning devices were useless, and here was a human, using nothing more than stones and his own strength. The tree began to lean, not quickly, not violently, but with a precision that seemed impossible. The blue-skinned student gasped. "That's not possible," he muttered. "You can't cut a tree like that with simple stones." But Jae-hwan was doing exactly that. He understood something the other students did not. Every tree has a natural weakness. Every piece of wood has a way it wants to fall. Working with nature, not against it, was the key to survival. As the first tree fell, he was already selecting the next one. His choices were not random. Each tree was selected for a specific purpose, some for walls, some for the roof, some for support. He saw the forest not as a collection of trees, but as a set of building materials. The crystal-like student approached. "Your methods are primitive," it said. Its voice was a strange vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Jae-hwan simply smiled. By now, other students had given up. Their complex shelters had collapsed. Their energy shields had failed. The planet's changing temperatures and harsh winds had destroyed everything they had tried to build. But Jae-hwan continued. Each tree fell exactly where he wanted. Each branch was cut with precise movements. He was not fighting the environment. He was working with it. Professor Keltrix's eyes swirled with colors that suggested deep thinking. This was not just survival. This was something more. This was understanding. As darkness began to fall, Jae-hwan had already gathered most of his materials. The other students watched in shock. While they had created nothing, he had a pile of carefully selected and prepared logs. The timer showed less than 12 hours remaining. Most students looked defeated. Their technology had failed. Their complex plans had fallen apart. Jae-hwan picked up another stone and continued working. Calm, steady, understanding. Night was falling fast. The two suns had disappeared behind a line of twisted mountains, leaving behind a sky that changed colors in ways no human had ever seen before. Purple mixed with deep green. Streaks of silver light danced between clouds that looked more like moving smoke than anything solid. Jae-hwan worked quickly but carefully. The logs he had cut earlier now began to take shape. Most of the alien students watched in total confusion. They had seen construction before, massive buildings created by energy fields and molecular assemblers. But this was different. This was something ancient, something pure. He started with the foundation, not by chance, but by careful planning. The ground had a slight slope that most would have ignored, but Jae-hwan understood water. He knew how it moved. The slight angle would help water flow away from his shelter, keeping it dry. The first logs went down perfectly. No energy tools, no advanced technology. Just understanding of wood, of balance, of how things fit together. Each log was placed with a precision that seemed impossible. The blue-skinned student with 4 arms watched in disbelief. How is he doing that? He whispered to the crystal-like student beside him. Professor Keltrix floated closer. His multiple eyes moved in complex patterns, tracking every single movement Jae-hwan made. Something extraordinary was happening. Interlocking the logs was an art form. Jae-hwan used smaller branches and carefully carved notches. Where most would use nails or energy bonds, he used the wood's own strength against itself. Each log fit so perfectly that it seemed almost impossible. The roof took shape next. Not flat, not simple, but with a careful slope that would shed water and snow. He understood something fundamental that the other students had missed. Shelter was not about creating a perfect box. It was about working with the environment. As the night grew darker, strange creatures began to make sounds. Clicks and whistles came from the ground. Something moved in the shadows between the trees. The other students huddled together, their failed shelters nothing more than sad piles of collapsed technology. Jae-hwan continued working. He found clay near a small stream. Most students would have ignored it, but he understood clay could be more than just mud. He began to create a simple but effective chimney. The placement was perfect. It would draw smoke up and away, while bringing warmth into the shelter. Stones became his next tool. Not random stones, specific stones with flat surfaces. He placed them carefully around the base of the shelter. They would help keep smaller creatures out. They would provide extra insulation. The crystal student approached. "Your method makes no sense," it said. Its voice was a strange vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Jae-won just smiled. As the night grew colder, his shelter began to take real shape. Walls that would block wind, a roof that would keep rain out, a design that understood the planet's harsh environment. Professor Keltrix's eyes swirled with colors that suggested deep thinking. This was not just survival. This was something more. This was understanding nature at its most fundamental level. The timer showed less than 6 hours remaining. Most students had given up. Their complex technology had failed completely. Jae-won picked up another log and continued working. Calm, steady, understanding. As the night grew darker and colder, Jae-won turned his attention to the most critical part of survival: heat. The other students had failed completely with their complex energy systems. They shivered in the growing cold, watching in disbelief. He began by clearing an area inside the shelter. Not randomly. Every movement was careful and planned. The ground needed to be flat but not completely level. A slight slope would help with water and air movement. From the stream nearby, he collected special clay. Most students would have ignored it. But Jae-won understood clay was more than just mud. It could hold heat. It could protect. He began to create something that looked simple, but was actually complex. A fire pit took shape. But this was no ordinary fire pit. The placement was perfect. The stones were carefully selected. Some were dark. Some were light. Some were smooth. Some were rough. Each stone had a purpose. Professor Keltrix watched with growing interest. His multiple eyes moved in complex patterns. The human was doing something unexpected. The blue-skinned student with 4 arms approached. "What are you doing?" he asked. His extra arms moved nervously. Complex devices hung from each arm, all now useless. Jae-won did not answer. Instead, he continued working. The fire pit was more than just a hole in the ground. It was a heat machine. The dark stones would absorb heat. The smooth stones would reflect heat. The rough stones would help with airflow. Each stone was placed with a purpose that most would never understand. Around the fire pit, he began to create something even more amazing. A system of heat movement. Mud and clay were not just thrown together. They were carefully placed. Channels were created. Air would move in specific ways. The crystal student watched in confusion. "Your method is primitive," it said. Its voice was a strange vibration. But Jae-won understood something they did not. Survival was not about complex technology. It was about understanding how heat moved, how air flowed, how materials worked together. He found special tree bark. Not all bark was the same. Some could help with insulation. Some could help with heat reflection. He began to line the shelter's walls. Each piece of bark was placed carefully. The mud he collected was not random mud. He tested it, felt it, understood its properties. Some areas would be thicker. Some would be thinner. Each layer had a purpose. As the night grew colder, the other students huddled together. Their complex shelters had failed. Their energy shields were gone. They were cold and afraid. Jae-won's shelter began to take shape. Not just a shelter, a heat machine. He created small holes in specific places. Not random holes, carefully planned holes. Air would move in ways that most would never understand. Hot air would rise. Cold air would sink. Everything was connected. Professor Keltrix's eyes swirled with colors that suggested deep thinking. This was not just survival. This was science. This was understanding nature at its most fundamental level. The timer showed less than 4 hours remaining. Most students had given up. Their technology had failed completely. Jae-won continued working. Calm, steady, understanding. As the first truly cold winds began to blow, his shelter was ready. A perfect machine of survival. Built with nothing more than stones, wood, and understanding. The twin moons rose high in the alien sky. Their light was strange, not white, but a mix of silver and deep blue that made the landscape look like something from a dream. The temperature dropped rapidly. Most students had given up hope. Jaehoan's shelter stood like a beacon of warmth and safety. Inside, he had prepared everything carefully. A small fire burned in the pit he had created. But this was no ordinary fire. It was a carefully managed heat source. The flames danced in a way that seemed almost alive, sending warmth through the entire shelter. Around him, the alien students watched in total shock. Their high-tech survival gear lay broken and useless. Complex energy shields had failed. Advanced temperature regulators had died within hours. But here was a human, sitting comfortably in a shelter built with nothing more than his hands and basic understanding. He began to prepare food. Not just survival food, but actual, proper food. Some local plants grew near the stream. Most students had ignored them, unsure if they were safe. Jaehoan knew better. He tested the plants carefully, smelled them, examined them. The blue-skinned student, with 4 arms, pressed his face against the shelter's wall. How is he doing that? He whispered to the crystal student beside him. Inside the shelter, Jaehoan roasted some of the local vegetation. The smell was strange but good. The fire threw warm light against the wooden walls. Every part of the shelter worked together. The walls kept the heat in. The fire pit maintained a perfect temperature. The carefully placed stones reflected and stored heat. Professor Keltrix floated just outside, his multiple eyes watching every single movement. This was more than just a survival test. This was a lesson in understanding. The night grew colder. Sounds came from outside. Strange clicks and whistles. Creatures moved in the darkness. The other students huddled together, shivering. Their shelters had collapsed. Their technology had failed. Jaehoan was warm. More than warm. Comfortable. He understood something fundamental that the other students had missed. Survival was not about fighting the environment. It was about working with it, understanding it, becoming part of it. The crystal student spoke again. "This is impossible," it said. Its voice was a strange vibration, but it was possible, and Jaehoan was proving it. He made tea from local plants. Not random tea, carefully selected plants that he knew would be safe. The steam rose in the firelight, creating patterns on the wooden walls. Every movement was careful. Every action planned. Outside, the wind blew hard. Temperatures continued to drop. The planet seemed to be testing everyone's survival skills. The other students looked broken. Their complex plans had failed completely. Their advanced technology was useless. But Jaehoan sat comfortably. The shelter was more than just a building. It was a living system. Heat moved perfectly. Air flowed correctly. Everything worked together. Professor Keltrix's eyes swirled with colors that suggested deep understanding. This was not just survival. This was something more. This was a lesson in how to truly understand an environment. As the night reached its coldest point, Jaehoan prepared to rest. His fire burned steady. His shelter was warm. Outside, the alien world continued its strange dance of survival. He had done what no other student could do. He had not just survived. He had thrived. As the first light of dawn broke across the alien landscape, Professor Keltrix gathered all the students for final evaluation. The testing ground looked like a battlefield of failed survival attempts. Broken energy shields lay scattered around. Collapsed shelters created sad piles of technological wreckage. Only one shelter stood untouched. Jaehoan emerged from his log cabin, looking calm and rested. The other students stared in disbelief. They had spent the night shivering, fighting the cold, their advanced technologies completely useless. Professor Keltrix's multiple eyes moved in complex patterns. Each eye seemed to be analyzing a different aspect of what had happened. The golden eye focused directly on Jaehoan. The purple eye scanned the shelter. The blue eye studied the surrounding environment. "Explain," the professor said. It was not a question. It was a demand. Jaehoan began to speak. He explained how he chose each log, how he understood the wood's natural strengths, how he read the landscape like a book. He talked about heat flow, about water movement, about understanding nature's own systems. The blue-skinned student with 4 arms interrupted. But our technology is advanced, he said. We have energy shields, molecular construction tools, complex survival systems. Jae-hwan simply smiled. Technology is good, he said, but understanding is better. Professor Keltrix moved closer. His tentacles moved in ways that suggested deep thinking. This was more than just a survival test. This was a fundamental challenge to everything the professor understood about survival. The crystal student spoke up. His methods are primitive, it said, but there was less certainty in its voice now. The shelter was more than just a building. It was a perfect system. The walls were precisely cut. The roof had the exact right slope. The fire pit was a marvel of simple engineering. Every single part worked together in a way that seemed almost impossible. Professor Keltrix began to ask questions. Complex questions, simple questions, technical questions, philosophical questions. Jae-hwan answered each one carefully. He did not just survive. He understood. The other students listened in total silence. Their advanced technologies lay broken around them. Their complex survival plans had failed completely. And here was a human, explaining survival with nothing more than basic understanding and careful observation. How? The professor asked. Did you know how to do this? Jae-hwan explained about human history, about survival skills passed down through generations, about understanding nature, about working with the environment, not against it. The testing ground became a classroom. The broken technologies became a lesson. The survival test became something more. Professor Keltrix's eyes continued to move. The golden eye suggested excitement. The purple eye suggested understanding. The blue eye suggested something close to respect. You have passed, the professor said finally. But it was clear this was more than just a pass. This was a revelation. The other students looked shocked. Their complex technologies meant nothing. Their advanced systems had failed completely, and a human, using nothing more than basic understanding, had shown them something fundamental about survival. As the suns began to rise higher, casting long shadows across the landscape, something had changed, not just in the testing ground, but in the understanding of survival itself. Jae-hwan had done more than build a shelter. He had challenged everything they thought they knew. 6 months after the survival test, the Galactic Research University's main conference hall was packed. Scientists, researchers, and students from hundreds of different planets filled every seat. Holographic displays hung in the air, showing images of Jae-hwan's shelter and the remarkable survival test. Professor Keltrix stood at the center of the stage. His multiple eyes moved across the audience, each eye telling a different part of the story. Behind him, a massive display showed the detailed analysis of human survival capabilities. Humans, the professor began, are not what we thought they were. The words echoed through the hall. Many alien scientists had believed humans were a young, primitive species. They thought humans relied too much on technology. They believed humans were weak compared to more advanced civilizations. This presentation would change everything. The display showed Jae-hwan's shelter from every angle. Scientific measurements filled the screen. Heat flow patterns, material strength calculations, environmental adaptation analysis. Each number told a story of incredible survival skills. Professor Keltrix's research paper had become the most discussed scientific document in the galaxy. Its title was simple but powerful: Homo sapiens, Masters of Adaptive Survival. The blue-skinned student who had watched Jae-hwan during the test sat in the front row. He now worked as a research assistant, studying human survival techniques. His 4 arms moved nervously as the presentation continued. Our previous understanding was completely wrong, Professor Keltrix explained. Humans do not survive through technology. They survive through understanding, through adaptation, through a deep connection with their environment. Images showed how Jae-hwan had read the landscape, how he understood wood, stone, fire, and water, how he created a shelter that was more than just a building. It was a living system. The crystal student, now a respected researcher, had completely changed her views. Her latest research paper explored human survival techniques. She had realized that technology was not always the answer. Professor Keltrix showed video from the survival test. Viewers could see how other advanced species had failed. Their complex technologies collapsed. Their energy shields died. Their molecular constructors proved useless. And then there was Jawan. Calm, steady, understanding. Humans have something we have forgotten, the professor said. The ability to truly see their environment, to work with nature, not against it. The implications were massive. Space exploration teams began to study human survival techniques. Military strategists rewrote survival training manuals. Educational systems across the galaxy started to include courses on human adaptability. Jawan himself sat in the back of the hall. He was not a speaker, not a hero, just a student who understood something fundamental about survival. The presentation ended. The hall was silent for a moment. Then applause broke out. Not just normal applause, but a deep, understanding appreciation. Professor Keltrix's final words hung in the air. Survival is not about having the best technology. It is about understanding. It is about adaptation. It is about becoming part of your environment. Outside the hall, the galaxy looked different. Humans were no longer seen as a young, primitive species. They were now understood as masters of survival. Adaptable, intelligent, connected to their environment in ways no one had previously understood. A new chapter in galactic understanding had begun.